Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create custom hooks in React. Now the reason you're going to want to create custom hooks is sometimes you're going to have logic that's being reused in multiple places. So you want to make that logic reusable, and in React that's usually done through custom hooks. I'm going to show you an example in our code. So as you can see, we have a use effect that fetches the data and handles the loading state and the error state and sets the data when it's successful. Now the problem is, in a real-world application, you're probably going to have a lot of components that fetch data all the time, right? So you're probably going to have a fetch call that gets the user information, or a fetch call that gets the to-dos, or a fetch call that gets whether the user is logged in or not. Now, all of these are done through, well, fetch calls. And as you can see, we're probably going to have a lot of duplicate logic. So this type of use effect, we're probably going to be using it multiple times throughout our application. Now, it's actually possible to make this reusable. And to make this reusable, we're actually going to use a custom hook. Now, the reason we're going to use a custom hook instead of a regular function is because if a function in React uses some kind of hook, such as use effect, then it should be marked as a custom hook. That's because, like I said, any function that uses hooks in React is marked as a custom hook. And I'm going to show you how to create this. In our case, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it useFetch. And I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it useFetch. Now, the reason I use the word use is because a custom hook must always start with the word use. So this is a requirement by React. Now what our custom hook is going to do is it's going to fetch the data, right? So we can copy and paste this into our custom hook, and as usual import the required stuff. And we're also going to take all of these states, such as the loading, the error state, and even the to-dos. We're also going to import useState because we actually need it. We're going to save. And what we're going to do is pretty much call the custom hook here. So I'm going to call it fetch equals useFetch. Now let me tell you how this custom hook works. So this custom hook is the exact same logic, except in this case, it's going to define the state, it's going to define the loading state and the error state. And it's going to use the fetch API as soon as the component loads. So how are we going to do this? Now, first thing, since our useFetch hook is reusable, as I'm going to use it in multiple places, it's best to rename this function. So instead of set-to-dos, we're going to use setData. And instead of to-dos, we're going to use data. So we're going to use generic naming. And one more thing, the URL should be dynamic since we're going to use this hook in multiple places. So a lot of the time we're going to be interacting with different resources. So it's not always going to be to-dos. So it's best to have this as a variable. So we're going to call this URL. And we're actually going to pass it as a parameter to our function, right? And as you can see, our dependency array lit up because, like I told you previously in useEffect, whenever you use an external value that's defined outside of the useEffect, you actually should declare it in the dependency array so that when the URL changes, useEffect is re-executed with the new URL. And now, in order to get the data from our useFetch, we actually need to return it. Just like in a React component, we return JSX. In this case, we're going to return the state inside of our useFetch. So I'm going to type return. I'm going to open the curly brackets, and I'm going to return the data that is loading state and the error state, because we're going to need these three. Now, if we go back to our app component, now we actually need to call the use fetch hook. So I'm going to type const, and I'm going to open the curly brackets, and we're actually going to need this data, and I'm going to replace this with the URL that we actually need. And as you can see, we need to import use fetch, but we're not exporting it, so we actually need to export this function. I'm going to type export, and now we can import it, and we should be good. Now our use fetch returns the error that is loading state and the data. Now we use this syntax, so because initially it's called data inside of the hook, but when we want to use it inside of this component, we want to use the name to do. So we're going to use an alias and rename data to to-dos. So if you have a different component, so for example, for the user profile, you can use data and you can use an alias for it as user profile. So now one more thing that we need, you can remember that we actually use set to-dos. So we actually need the set state function. So we're also going to return the set data function because we actually need it in our application, and we're going to use the set data. And as usual, it's called set data, but in our to-dos list, we use the set to-dos name. So we're going to use an alias and call it set to-dos. So right now, we actually have the same exact behavior as before. So our application didn't change. And if I go back and refresh, you can see everything is working as before. We can toggle state on and off. We can add new to-dos. So all we did was refactor things around to make it more reusable. So as you can see, the powerful thing about use fetch is we can use it in multiple places. So it doesn't matter what we're actually fetching. All we need to do is provide the URL, and we actually get the data. We get whether it's loading or not, and we get whether there's an error or not. So this is the cool thing about reusing functions, and more specifically hooks in React. And one of the biggest conditions, and now the conditions for turning a function into a hook or a custom hook, is there are two conditions. The function must at least use a hook, and it must start with the use keyword. So this is how React understands that this is a custom hook. So this is actually a requirement, and this is exactly how React understands that it's a custom hook. And like I said previously, a custom hook is basically just a reusable function, except that it uses React hooks. In our case, it uses use state and use effect. And now one thing that you may have noticed, so if I go back to our application and refresh, so these to-dos, we actually fetch them from our database, which is the db.json file, which is found here. And we can actually do some operations on it. We can delete stuff, we can add stuff. But the thing is, when we refresh the app, everything resets, because these modifications that we're doing, we're actually doing them on local state. So after we fetch the data from the server, we set it as local React state in the data variable, and then we modify it using set data. But we don't actually update the information in the database, right? We only use it for reading, but we don't do any updating. And I will resolve this in future videos and teach you how to actually use JSON server and the fetch API to make modifications to the database. So we can add to-dos to the database, we can remove, and we can also update. And these are usually called CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete. And most of the time in web applications or applications in general, this is what you're going to be doing most of the time, which are CRUD operations. So thank you for watching, and see you in my next video.